Regardless of how efficient the human mind is, it is shaped by the narratives that are fed into it. Those who control the narrative that are fed into the human mind are able to manipulate minds to think in ways that serve their own interests. The reason why many black people are now self-loathing, perceives ourselves as being our own worst enemies, and reveres Caucasians in spite of such a brutally horrific history to the contrary, has nothing to do with a silly slave syndrome myth, nor is it the Stockholm syndrome, as so many have misdiagnosed. Usually people have the right to believe whatever they choose to believe. However, there's a profound exception to this rule when it comes to the oppressed. The oppressed must function based upon what's actually true. Because if our understandings are flawed, then all liberating remedies that stems from those misunderstandings will also be flawed. The solution to all problems begin with gaining a clear, concise, and accurate understanding of the problem. This is an inherent fact within the human condition. When we know better, we do better. If this was not true, then white oppressive forces would not have deliberately spread so much disinformation into the black community. They did so to prevent us from gaining a clear understanding of our plight and condition that's required to liberate ourselves. It is for this reason why those who know the truth must teach African proverb. The true reason why many black people are now self-loathing, perceives ourselves as being our own worst enemies, and reveres Caucasians in spite of such a brutally horrific history of the contrary, is directly correlated to the white society's monopoly over information that is systematically and repeatedly fed into our minds. A profound fact that millions of black people have become desensitized from realizing is that whenever we argue among ourselves about how messed up we are as a people, we do so quoting data that comes exclusively from white sources. Black people's interpretation of our collective state comes exclusively from narratives written exclusively by white people. This means that white people that have never earned the trust of black people literally owns black people's interpretation of ourselves. It's been this way for so long that most black people have normalized it and therefore no longer recognizes it. Millions of black people have been psychologically conditioned to automatically blindly accept whatever narrative that white sources says about us without even thinking about fact checking it. Because the white society controls the narrative that black people receive, this allows them to control what black people believe and how we function as a people. To fully understand the immense ramification of this scenario, you have to learn of how narratives are used to control people at the stereo population. People are controlled by narratives. This is clearly seen when the ruling class gives soldiers a pretext for going to war. The ruling class creates a false narrative that conceals their true nefarious reason for going to war. And they give a false narrative to the soldiers. The false narrative is always a positive one that claims that the soldiers are righting a wrong, that they're on the right side of history. They then present the false narrative to millions of soldiers. These millions of soldiers accept the narratives and begin functioning based upon it as being factual. These soldiers would then travel thousands of miles away and kill strangers based upon the narrative. Some soldiers would lay down their lives in defense of the narrative. It doesn't matter that the narrative is untrue. What only matters is that the soldiers believe the narrative is true. People function based upon the narratives that they've been given and have accepted as being true. Likewise, this same social science of utilizing the power of narratives is what's being used against black people by white oppressive forces. Our true core problem is that those with the ability to create false narrative that makes us think and function in ways that are against our own interests are doing so. The ruling white elites systematically creates false black sabotaging narratives and then presents them to black people. Millions of black people then naively accept those false narratives and begin functioning based upon them in ways that are against our own interests and that instead benefits the interests of the white society. This is the truth of our plight and condition, the truth that many of us have been blinded from seeing. People are easily controlled by the narratives that they receive about themselves. If people constantly receive positive, affirming narratives about themselves, this raises their collective self-esteem, inspires them, and unifies them. However, if people constantly receive fraudulent negative narratives about themselves, the exact opposite happens. They become demoralized, divided, self-loathing, and the collective aggression shifts away from their oppressors and is redirected towards themselves, and they can then be ruled over indefinitely. This second example is precisely what's being done to black people. Presently, white government agents that specialize in psychiatry and propaganda analyze and study everything about the black population: our beliefs, our likes, our dislikes, our strengths, our vulnerabilities. This surveillance information is gathered, and then decisions are then made on which fraudulent stories to produce to best create certain psychological feelings among the black population that assist the white society in maintaining its control and dominance over black people. And here's why this was done. During the 1960s, African Americans' unified protest against the U.S. system of white supremacy was unprecedented. African Americans confronted it on all fronts. It was confronted through civil disobedience tactics, militant means, nonviolent protests, and with black lawyers pleading for equality within America's highest Supreme Court. African Americans' unified protest still remains unrivaled by any other racial group in U.S. history. In the face of such unprecedented unified black protests, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said that the unification of the American Negro was the greatest threat against the nation. Being unified was against the nation's interests. Isn't it something? African Americans had unknowingly proved themselves as being the greatest threat against the U.S. system of white supremacy. To remedy what was then called the Negro problem in 1967, President Lyndon Johnson put together a committee called the Kerner Commission. Their assignment was to study the Negro problem, find the cause of the problem, and then develop a solution. In 1968, white social scientists hired by the Kerner Commission determined that decade's unprecedented unified black protests that was caused by blatant white racism, an elevated and unifying black collective self-esteem brought on by the emergence of the Black Pride movement. And they also learned that while the white oppressors, through their weaponry advantage of guns and cannons, were able to invade and enslave black people, they, however, cannot win our loyalty or sustain peace with us indefinitely unless our minds have been manipulated to keep us loyal towards the white society and prevent dissent from rising among us. Because whenever people are oppressed for long duration, their collective aggressions toward their oppressors will continue to grow until acts of massive rebellion becomes inevitable. The oppressed always eventually engages in massive rebellion against their oppressors. This is an inherent response within the collective human psyche whenever people are held under long-term oppression. This is what was happening during the 1960s. Those white social scientists largely determined that they could subdue unified black protests by developing covert methods of white racism, and also by lowering the collective self-esteem of black people, and by shifting black people's collective aggression away from the white society and redirected against ourselves, by deploying propaganda campaigns that constantly subject black people to receiving only the fraudulent, racially devaluing, and divisive content about ourselves. The white media's unrelenting negative depiction of black people that amplifies the negative to the point that it distorts our reality is much more than just biased media reporting. It is actually a covert, insidious, black, racially demoralizing, divide and conquer psychological warfare campaign. Demoralize, divide, and conquer is a method of maintaining control over a targeted population through constant and unrelenting demoralization in order to create self-loathing and division between them. It is a well-proven tactic. Whenever those in power wants to brainwash an entire generation of people into thinking and behaving as they need them to, the first step is to always heavily demoralize them. This lowers their collective self-esteem, divides their ranks, turns collective aggressions away from their oppressors and redirected towards themselves, and then makes them more compliant with their oppressor's dominance over their lives. In fact, many will even prefer it. This system of control is deployed like a massive media marketing campaign that constantly subjects Black people to receiving only the fraudulent worst narratives about ourselves. Within this system, fraudulent, Black, racially devaluing and demoralizing propaganda is being pumped unrelentingly into the unsuspecting minds of the Black population without being challenged or counterbalanced by an equal amount of Black positive, racially affirming information. It conveys a subliminal message that Black people are now our own worst enemies and that we therefore need white people to govern over our lives. Moreover, that Black people should admire, respect, and trust only whites. This system is extremely effective because when Black people are repetitively presented these noted narratives from trusted white media sources, it can be very difficult to resist its implied propaganda programming, especially when the propaganda is being told daily and so unrelentingly. With time, being unable to refute the constant negative information about ourselves, many Black people eventually comes to accept them. They demoralize us to such an extent that we begin to doubt our ability to govern ourselves, and we therefore become more compliant with white dominance over our lives. This propaganda campaign is in fact so efficient that it causes many Black people to prefer white dominance over our lives and become self-hating towards their own people. It's the true reason why many Black people are now self-loathing, perceive ourselves as being our own worst enemies, and reveres Caucasians in spite of real history to the contrary. It is always by deliberate design when the minds of the oppressed aligns with the needs of the oppressors. Always. This is all possible because people are like computers. All you have to do is give them certain information every so often, and you can persuade an entire generation towards an applied objective. It doesn't matter if the narratives being presented are untrue. All that matters is that Black people believe it's true. And most Black people act upon it because they've all received the same information. This is the hidden reality that a lot of our people need to understand. This control system allows white media controllers of information to shape the minds of Black people in ways that serve the white society. Its weapon is the demoralizing message that it carries and the way that it adversely affects the Black population in terms of our behavior. No group can be constantly inundated with negative information about themselves and not be adversely affected. None is not possible. Most people will be adversely affected. The constant and taunting negative propaganda unconsciously influence how Black people perceives ourselves. This is creating internalized self-hatred. This is the cause for the internalized, the unprecedented self-hatred. Black people walk around all the time speaking negatively about ourselves. That's not a normal thing. That's not normal. The basis of this concept of warfare works by affecting the subconscious minds of the Black population through demoralizing propaganda. It works by tapping into the immense power that shame has upon the human mind. This system is so effective that it negatively manipulates Black people to such an extent that despite an abundance of available information, no one is able to come to any sensible conclusion in the interest of defending ourselves, our families, and our communities. Through the skillful, sustained use of repetitive media propaganda campaigns, white oppressive forces have created an elaborate prison for the minds of Black people. Those Black people that do not critically think, nor question the validity of all information they receive from the white society, are the ones that become self-hating and mentally enslaved while never noticing their mental change. This psychological warfare system provides white oppressive forces with a more proficient method for controlling Black people. For unlike the past blatant white racism that black people were easily able to identify and therefore develop counter strategies against, this suppression system is not easily recognized, nor is it easily comprehended by many of its black victims. This psychological warfare is the reason why our people we walk around with so much self-contempt. And it is so pervasive in our communities. We've normalized it. It is the root of the profound division and self-hatred now afflicting so many within the black community. It is also at the heart of the internalized feelings of superiority that many whites possess. Sadly, but it's true, the oppressed will always believe the fraudulent worst about themselves. Frantz Fanon said that, and it is absolutely true. This is not some feeble-minded premise, nor is it a silly conspiracy theory. Our media social engineering through propaganda campaign is a real covert, well-crafted system of control that allows the white ruling class to control the masses and targeted populations. Moreover, according to the U.S. military doctrine on psychological warfare, it states that the most effective way to subdue and control a large targeted population without actually physically fighting them is by perpetually inundating them with fraudulent, demoralizing propaganda about themselves. More specifically, with disinformation that misleads them to believe that their core problem is an internalized one. When people are made to believe that their core problem lies within themselves, this shifts their collective aggressions away from their enemies and redirects it towards themselves. It also makes them resentful towards their own group and makes them more compliant with the dominance of other groups over their lives. And again, and it says, many will even prefer it. Now listen, the similarities between this psychological warfare tactic as laid out in a military doctrine of psychological warfare, it is too exact to the condition and experience that we black people are enduring for us not to recognize that this is precisely what they're doing to us. This is precisely. Logically, they're going to utilize that same apparatus to manipulate the minds of millions of black people to think in ways that serves and protect the system of white supremacy. It's simply the people they are. It's the way they've always been. And it's the only way that they know how to be. The true name of this nefarious system remains classified. So many of us have appropriately named it the Black People's Matrix. Now you know what the Black People's Matrix is. Those who know must teach. And a speaker of truth has no friends. The time of believing in idiotic, ignorant things, we don't have the luxury anymore to do that. We have to wake up. We have to wake up. One love and peace.